Thick black smoke curls above the flat industrial coastline of Bahrain as the morning call to prayer still echoes across the island kingdom. Within minutes of a single Iranian drone piercing the country's air defenses on Sunday morning, March 8th, the unthinkable has happened. A water desalination plant, the kind of sprawling, critical, strategic infrastructure that converts the warm waters of the Persian Gulf into the drinking water that sustains an entire desert nation, lies damaged, its windows shattered, its outer walls scarred by shrapnel, its workers scrambling to assess the scale of what just struck them. According to Bahrain's Ministry of Interior, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps launched the drone attack that caused what officials described as material damage to the facility, a plant that is part of a fragile network of approximately 103 desalination installations that together produce the vast majority of Bahrain's freshwater supply. The shockwaves of this single strike sent tremors far beyond the small island nation. Because what happened in Bahrain on that quiet Sunday morning was not merely an attack on a building. It was an attack on the most fundamental human necessity in one of the most water-scarce regions on Earth.
Bahrain has no rivers. It has no natural aquifers capable of sustaining its population. Approximately 90% of the drinking water consumed by the island kingdom's roughly 1.5 million residents comes from desalination plants that line its coast, massive industrial facilities that draw in seawater and push out the fresh water that flows through every tap, every hospital, every school, every home. When that drone struck on Sunday morning, it did not merely damage concrete and steel. It struck at the single point of vulnerability that security analysts have warned about for decades: the terrifying fragility of a civilization built on technology that converts ocean into life. Bahrain's Electricity and Water Authority moved swiftly to confirm that water and electricity services to residents were not affected by the strike. But officials acknowledged the material damage was significant, and the psychological impact was immediate. Within hours, long lines formed at stores selling bottled water across the capital, Manama. The message was unmistakable. If Iran can hit one desalination plant, it can hit them all. Before we dive deeper into what happened and what it means for the entire Gulf region and millions of ordinary people who depend on desalinated water to survive, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. These dramatic geopolitical developments are reshaping the world in real time, and staying informed has never been more important as this situation continues to unfold. The Iranian strike on Bahrain's desalination infrastructure did not happen in isolation. According to Iranian officials, the IRGC launched the attack in direct retaliation for what Tehran claimed was a prior American strike on an Iranian desalination plant on Keshem Island, a strategically located landmass in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, declared on social media that the United States had committed a blatant and desperate crime by attacking a freshwater desalination plant on Keshem Island, adding that water supply to 30 villages had been impacted, and warning that the United States set this precedent, not Iran. The IRGC went further, claiming it had struck the American naval base at Jafar in Bahrain with precision-guided solid fuel and liquid fuel missiles, specifically in response to the Keshem attack. Meanwhile, the American military offered a sharply different account. The United States Central Command has not confirmed or acknowledged striking any Iranian desalination facility. Pentagon officials speaking on background suggested that damage to Iranian water infrastructure may have been incidental to strikes on nearby military targets, rather than the result of deliberate targeting. This sharp contrast between competing narratives immediately created uncertainty about the true sequence of events and the intent behind each strike, leaving analysts, governments, and ordinary citizens across the Gulf struggling to determine who struck first, who escalated the targeting of civilian water infrastructure, and whether this represented a deliberate new phase of the conflict or a series of tragic miscalculations spiraling beyond control. What is beyond dispute is the extraordinary vulnerability that this incident exposed.
According to a 2026 study published in NPJ Clean Water, using data from Global Water Intelligence, approximately 5,000 desalination plants operate across the Middle East, producing roughly 29 million cubic meters of water per day, accounting for about 42% of global desalination capacity. The Gulf Cooperation Council states alone hold approximately 60% of the world's total desalination capacity and produce around 40% of all desalinated water through more than 400 plants lining the Persian Gulf coast. Kuwait depends on desalination for 90% of its drinking water, Oman for 86%, Saudi Arabia for 70%, the United Arab Emirates for 42%, and Bahrain, the island nation with no rivers and no aquifers, for approximately 90%. These are not statistics. These are the thin technological threads upon which millions of human lives depend every single day. Neil Quilliam, an associate fellow at Chatham House's Middle East and North Africa program, told reporters that the attack on Bahrain represented a major escalation. According to his assessment, Iran was moving from striking assets that hurt Gulf economies and global energy markets to ones that would have a material effect on the livelihoods of Gulf citizens. This was no longer about oil tankers and shipping lanes and stock market fluctuations. This was about whether people could turn on their taps and receive water. The strategic implications were enormous. Could Iran systematically target the desalination infrastructure of every Gulf state? Could a sustained campaign of drone strikes against these large, fixed, impossible-to-relocate facilities create a humanitarian catastrophe in one of the world's wealthiest regions? Analysts were still assessing the full scope of vulnerability, but the preliminary conclusions were deeply alarming. Meanwhile, financial markets reacted with characteristic speed and anxiety. Brent crude oil, already elevated above $100 per barrel due to the near-total closure of the Strait of Hormuz, surged further on the news that civilian infrastructure was now being actively targeted by both sides of the conflict. Within hours of the Bahrain strike, Brent touched $101 before settling slightly lower. The broader market carnage was staggering. The S&P 500 had already fallen more than 1.5%. The Nasdaq had dropped nearly 2%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average had shed 740 points in a single session earlier in the week. The Russell 2000, tracking smaller companies most vulnerable to energy price shocks, plunged 2%. The average 30-year fixed-rate mortgage climbed to 6.3%, the highest since early February, pushed higher by rising government bond yields driven by war uncertainty. Insurance premiums for commercial operations in the Gulf, already at historic highs, spiked again as underwriters struggled to price the risk of operating in a region where desalination plants, data centers, airports, and oil facilities were all demonstrating vulnerability to drone and missile attack. The Dubai financial market and the Bahrain bourse both declined sharply in Monday morning trading as investors processed the implications of a war that was no longer confined to military targets, but was now threatening the basic infrastructure of civilian life. The economic ripple effects extended far beyond stock tickers and commodity charts. In Bahrain, where the economy had already been strained by repeated Iranian attacks on hotels, ports, residential towers, and the area surrounding the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet headquarters at Jufair, the desalination plant strike created a new category of economic anxiety. Businesses that depended on stable water and electricity supply began reassessing their operations. International companies with Gulf headquarters started activating contingency plans. The tourism sector, already devastated by the conflict, faced another blow as the prospect of water infrastructure vulnerability made the entire region appear uninhabitable to foreign visitors and workers. Within minutes of the news breaking, social media across the Gulf was flooded with residents sharing photographs of empty water bottle shelves in supermarkets, a visual that carried more emotional weight than any stock market chart. Meanwhile, the attack on Bahrain's desalination infrastructure also exposed a critical interconnection that few outside the region understood. Many Gulf desalination plants are co-located with power stations, meaning that damage to water facilities can simultaneously disrupt electricity supply. According to energy infrastructure analysts, the dual-use nature of these facilities means a single successful strike can cascade into both water and power outages, creating compound crises that overwhelm emergency response capabilities. Bahrain's grid survived this particular attack intact, but the precedent it established was deeply alarming to infrastructure security officials across every GCC capital. The targeting of water infrastructure carries profound legal and humanitarian implications that distinguish it from strikes on oil facilities, military bases, or government buildings. Article 54 of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions explicitly prohibits attacks on drinking water installations and supplies intended for civilian populations. Deliberate attacks on such facilities can constitute war crimes under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The fact that both sides in this conflict have now accused each other of striking desalination plants, Iran claiming the United States hit Keshem Island first, Bahrain accusing Iran of retaliating against civilian targets, creates a legal and moral morass that international institutions may take years to untangle. But for the ordinary families in Bahrain who lined up for bottled water on Sunday morning, the legal questions were secondary to a far more primal concern. Would there be water tomorrow? Meanwhile, the broader context of this strike illuminated a vulnerability that intelligence agencies have understood for decades. According to one regional analyst, the strategic exposure that Langley identified more than 4 decades ago has grown dramatically. During the 1990-1991 Gulf War, Iraqi forces deliberately destroyed most of Kuwait's desalination capacity, and the resulting damage to the country's water supply was severe and long-lasting. That historical precedent hung over every Gulf capital as news of the Bahrain strike spread. If Iran were to conduct a sustained campaign against desalination infrastructure across the GCC, the consequences could be catastrophic. Bahrain, Kuwait, and Qatar, the 3 most water-stressed nations in the Gulf, have minimal strategic water reserves. Unlike oil, which can be stored in massive quantities, fresh water cannot be stockpiled at the scale needed to sustain entire national populations. Storage tanks and bottled water imports are limited and costly alternatives that could sustain populations for days or weeks, not months. The military dimension of protecting these facilities presented its own set of staggering challenges. Desalination plants are, by their very nature, large, fixed, coastal installations that cannot be relocated, hardened, or concealed. They require constant access to seawater intake, making them impossible to move inland. Their cooling systems and chemical treatment processes make them sensitive to even minor disruptions. And the Gulf coastline is dotted with hundreds of them, creating a target-rich environment that would require unprecedented air defense coverage to fully protect. Gulf states have invested heavily in missile defense systems, including American-made Patriot batteries and the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System. But the drone that struck Bahrain's desalination plant was a low-cost, low-altitude, unmanned aerial vehicle of the type that has proven notoriously difficult to intercept with systems designed to counter ballistic missiles. The asymmetry was brutal in its simplicity. A drone costing perhaps tens of thousands of dollars could threaten a desalination plant worth hundreds of millions, producing water for hundreds of thousands of people. Meanwhile, military responses from across the region underscored the escalating chaos. Kuwait's military announced it had intercepted additional missiles and drones from Iran on the same day. The United Arab Emirates said Iran had launched more than 100 missiles and drones in new barrages, though only 4 drones fell at unnamed locations, according to the UAE Defense Ministry. Saudi Arabia said it destroyed a drone headed toward the vast Sheba oil field and shot down 4 drones over Riyadh, including one aimed at the diplomatic quarter. 2 people were killed in Saudi Arabia's Al-Kharj city when a projectile struck a residential location, the victims identified as Indian and Bangladeshi nationals. 2 Kuwaiti firefighters were killed while performing duties during Iranian strikes. In Bahrain itself, beyond the desalination plant, missile fragments fell onto a road in Manama, injuring 1 person and damaging several shops, while debris injured 3 people and damaged a university building in the Muharraq area. The sheer geographic spread of Iranian attacks, hitting targets across at least half a dozen countries simultaneously, suggested a campaign designed not just to inflict damage, but to overwhelm the collective defense capabilities of the entire Gulf Alliance structure. The psychological dimension may have been as important as the physical damage. According to one water security researcher, the most significant impact was psychological. Water is essential to human life, and the perception of risk can cause fear and panic, which is particularly challenging in the current environment, where authorities are working to maintain calm. In Bahrain, where thousands of American service members and their families live near the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters at Jufair, a base that has been repeatedly targeted by Iranian missiles and drones since the war began on February 28th, the desalination plant strike added a new layer of anxiety to an already terrified population. Could the next drone take out their water supply entirely? How long would emergency reserves last? Was it time to leave? Stars and Stripes, the military publication, reported from Manama that the island kingdom is home to thousands of American service members and their families, many living in the capital near the naval base that has been attacked repeatedly since Operation Epic Fury began. For these families, the desalination plant attack transformed an already frightening situation into something existential. Military families had endured sirens, missile interceptions visible from their apartment windows, and the constant hum of combat aircraft overhead. But the prospect of losing drinking water introduced a vulnerability that no amount of military hardware could address. Reports indicated that the U.S. military was exploring emergency water supply contingencies for American personnel, including potential desalination capability aboard naval vessels and emergency airlift of bottled water from outside the theater of operations. For ordinary Bahraini citizens, the impact was equally acute. Bahrain is a small nation, an island with a total area smaller than many American cities, where news travels at the speed of a text message, and where virtually everyone is within minutes of the coast. When word spread that a desalination plant had been struck, the reaction was visceral and immediate. Parents filled bathtubs with water as a precaution. Families loaded cars with bottled water from every store they could reach. Social media filled with questions about which plant had been hit, whether it was still operating, and whether other plants were being defended. The government's rapid assurance that water services remained unaffected was essential in preventing a larger panic, but the underlying fear had been planted. In a nation where 90% of drinking water comes from facilities exactly like the one that had just been struck, the margin between normalcy and crisis was terrifyingly thin. Meanwhile, the diplomatic consequences rippled outward. Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian had earlier attempted a conciliatory tone toward Gulf neighbors, calling them friends and brothers, and appearing to signal a desire to limit collateral damage in the region. But those remarks were followed by continued strikes on Gulf states, including the desalination plant attack, creating confusion about whether Tehran's leadership was genuinely seeking de-escalation or merely providing rhetorical cover for ongoing operations. Iranian state media later reported that Pezeshkian's conciliatory comments had been misinterpreted by the enemy, seeking to sow division with neighbors, effectively walking back the olive branch within hours of extending it. Gulf states found themselves caught in an impossible position, hosting American military assets that made them targets of Iranian retaliation, while lacking the ability to independently defend their critical infrastructure from sustained drone and missile campaigns. The desalination plant attack also could not be separated from a broader pattern of Iranian strikes targeting civilian and technological infrastructure across the Gulf. Within days of the war beginning, Iranian drones had struck Amazon Web Services data centers in Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, knocking cloud computing facilities offline and raising questions about the vulnerability of the Gulf's rapidly expanding digital economy. The IRGC had also targeted fuel tanks at Kuwait International Airport, government buildings in Kuwait City, hotels and residential towers in Bahrain, and the diplomatic quarter of Riyadh. Each successive attack expanded the categories of civilian infrastructure considered legitimate targets in this conflict, creating a terrifying escalation ladder, where today it was a data center, tomorrow a desalination plant, and the day after that, analysts warned, it might be hospitals, electrical grids, or telecommunications networks.
The pattern was not lost on regional security officials. One Gulf defense analyst, speaking to reporters on condition of anonymity, described the Iranian strategy as systematic pressure on the seams of Gulf civilization. The logic was straightforward. Gulf states had modernized at breathtaking speed, building extraordinary cities and economies in the span of a few decades. But that very modernity created dependencies on desalinated water, on imported food, on digital infrastructure, on foreign labor, on stable energy exports that constituted a complex web of vulnerabilities. Iran did not need to match the military power of the United States to inflict devastating consequences on American allies. It merely needed to demonstrate that it could disrupt the systems those allies depended upon for daily existence. And with each successive strike on a new category of civilian infrastructure, that demonstration became more convincing. The international response was fragmented and largely insufficient. The United Nations Secretary General had already condemned both U.S.-Israeli strikes and Iranian retaliations in broad terms. UNESCO had expressed concern over cultural heritage sites, particularly after the damage to Tehran's Golistan Palace. But no international body had yet addressed the specific and emerging threat to water infrastructure in a region where desalination is not a luxury, but the prerequisite for human survival. The International Committee of the Red Cross had called for all parties to respect international humanitarian law. But such appeals had proven ineffective against the escalating logic of retaliation that was driving both sides to strike ever more essential civilian targets. Meanwhile, Bahrain's Civil Aviation Affairs announced it had coordinated the successful transfer of aircraft from Bahrain International Airport to alternative airports, a measure officials described as enhancing operational readiness, but which analysts interpreted as preparation for the possibility that the airport itself might become a target. The move underscored the degree to which every aspect of daily life in the Gulf was being reshaped by a conflict that had begun as strikes on Iranian military and nuclear facilities, but had metastasized into a multi-front war touching virtually every country in the region. The incident forced an uncomfortable reckoning across the region. For decades, Gulf states had invested billions in building the world's most advanced desalination infrastructure, transforming uninhabitable desert coastlines into gleaming modern cities. That infrastructure was the foundation upon which everything else was built: the skyscrapers, the airports, the shopping malls, the universities, the hospitals. Without desalinated water, none of it functions. And on a quiet Sunday morning in March, a single Iranian drone demonstrated just how fragile that foundation truly was. The truth remains unclear about many aspects of this escalation. Who struck first? Was the Keshem Island attack deliberate or incidental? Was the Bahrain strike targeted retaliation or indiscriminate bombardment, as Bahrain's government claimed? The fog of war makes definitive answers impossible, and both sides have powerful incentives to shape the narrative in their favor. What is undeniable is that a new threshold has been crossed. Water infrastructure, the most basic requirement of human survival, is now within the targeting calculus of at least one side in this conflict, and possibly both. The world watches as the implications of that threshold reverberate across a region where 5,000 desalination plants stand between civilization and catastrophe. In the end, what happened in Bahrain on March 8th may be remembered not for the physical damage to a single facility, which officials say was repaired within days, but for the psychological and strategic rupture it represented. For the first time in this conflict, the war reached not just the economies and military installations of the Gulf,
but the most intimate infrastructure of daily human existence. The water that flows from a tap, the invisible necessity that makes life in the desert possible. When that is threatened, everything built upon it trembles. Alliances that seemed solid become uncertain. Populations that tolerated hosting foreign military bases begin asking whether the protection is worth the risk. And the fundamental question of every conflict, who is willing to go further, takes on a dimension that transcends military strategy and enters the realm of basic human survival. The Gulf states now face a choice that no amount of wealth or military hardware can simplify. How do you defend infrastructure that is, by its nature, large, fixed, coastal, and exposed? How do you stockpile something as essential and voluminous as water for an entire nation? How do you maintain the calm of a civilian population that has just learned its drinking water can be taken away by a single drone, costing a fraction of what one desalination plant produces in a single hour? These are questions that analysts, military planners, and government officials across the region are grappling with in real time. And the answers may reshape not just the current conflict, but the entire security architecture of the Persian Gulf for decades to come. Stay tuned for more updates as this situation continues to develop. Make sure you subscribe so you never miss dramatic developments shaping the world.